Welcome to the Plane Hoppers Guild.
Greetings, adventurers, explorers, treasure seekers, and sellswords. Welcome to the Plane Hoppers Guild. I am Dungeon Lord Jay.
And I'm Journeyman Eric.
And we're going to talk about D&D today.
So for this session, I have a positively enchanting topic I'm looking forward to chatting with Jay about. All about the Fae, something I believe a lot of new DMs don't really get into.
Yes, I had a hard time when I first started sort of wrapping my head around the Fae, and with good reason. They're kind of a confusing bunch. But we should just dive right into it because it's gonna be it's gonna be a long one, so buckle up. So, Fae are a sort of group of creatures, a category of creatures in D&D. And if you want to talk about the Fae, you got to talk about where they come from first, the Feywild. So the Feywild, or the plane of fairy, is cosmologically, it's an echo of the prime material plane that's sort of suffused with potent primal magic and unrestrained emotion. I imagine it as the material plane is like a circle and like a Venn diagram. On one side, sort of overlapping, we have the Shadowfell, and on the other side, we have the Feywild. And the Feywild is sort of a echo of the prime material plane that's filled with sort of natural beauty. Colors are more vivid. Sounds are clearer, emotions heightened. But on the same token, on the other side, shadows appear darker and impulses are harder to control.
It's kind of like a very raw, undiluted sort of vision and emotion.
Absolutely. Something that I find interesting about the Feywild is that the geography of the Feywild is very similar to the prime material plane, but it's also different. For example, where there may be like a large city like Waterdeep or something, there may be another city, in the Feywild, or there may be, a forest glade. The mountain that's nearby the city, that's where it should be in the Feywild. And the ocean is where it should be in the Feywild. But instead of a city there's just a evergreen forest. Giant mushrooms and giant trees and flowers. And it appears as the Feywild always appears as though it's either twilight or like the rising sun. The Feywild is beautiful, stunningly so. But it's also extremely deadly. I always sort of associate it with this example, right? Where you may be walking through the forest and you accidentally slip through a Fey crossing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And you find yourself in the Feywild. And as you're roaming through the Feywild, you see, a group of elves or satyrs or some sort of Fey beings, just dancing and drinking and merrymaking around a fire. And it looks very alluring and fun. And if you go up to them and you partake in the drink or you dance with them, you may find you can never stop. And you'll be, cursed to dance forever until you die.
Right. It's in a way, it's a bit more sinister than the Shadowfell. Because, with twisted shadow monsters and darkness, that's very clearly dangerous. But going into like this beautiful world of nature and lights, you don't expect it to be so deadly.
Absolutely. And if you are in the Feywild, it's common that the geography around you can be sort of manipulated by your emotional state and the emotional state of the Fey creatures that live there. So if you're like scared of a scary forest, it's going to continue to get scarier.
Oh, so it kind of feeds off of your emotions.
Yes. Well, definitely. And that sort of brings me into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is Fey travel. So because the Feywild mirrors the material plane, sometimes the veil between the two is thin, right? So if there's a forest in the Feywild, there may be a forest in the prime material plane, and they are so similar that you may accidentally slip into the Feywild. And I always imagine Fey crossing I always imagine the Feywild is very much like Alice in Wonderland, right? And how Alice sort of slips into Wonderland through a rabbit hole, right? But that's a Fey crossing. You know, that's how she went from her world to the Feywild. And it could be, you know, a hole in a tree or a mushroom circle or just, you know, wandering through the forest, and you may find yourself in the Feywild. And not only, as we were discussing before, not only is the Feywild like dangerous because of the creatures that live there, but it can be very dangerous because time and memory work very weirdly there. For example, if you go into, there's like a time dilation, right? So if you go into the Feywild as like a child, let's say, and you spend your entire life in the Feywild, growing up in the Feywild, you know, but you become an adult and you somehow accidentally slip into the material plane, you may find that only 10 minutes have passed since you left and you're still a child again. But maybe you might remember everything that you experienced in the Feywild. Or because memory is so fucked up, sometimes you forget. So you may have entered the Feywild and spent months there, return to the material plane, and, you know, no time has passed, and you have no memory of even going into the Feywild. It's almost like a dream, almost.
Kind of just keeping fragments that, you know, something happened, but you just can't
remember. Yes, exactly. And time works both ways that way. So you can, like, it's very Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe, right? Like, if you may go into this place and when you come back, no time has passed in the material plane, or you may go into this place for 60 seconds and 10 years have passed on the material plane. You know, or 100 years. All of your friends and family are dead now, you know? And you could also not remember being in the Feywild, so you have no idea what time skipped. So that could be potentially extremely dangerous. But something else to talk about, and I sort of mentioned it before, is like traveling through the Feywild. So this is the first thing we're talking about, traveling into the Feywild. But traveling through the Feywild is like distance and like terrain versus your emotional state. So if you're in a scary forest and you're scared in the Feywild, it may take longer to get to where you're going. You may take longer to get out because you're scared and the place gets scarier and scarier. Or if you're just really stoked to get where you're going, it may just go breeze by. Like you can't believe how far you've traveled in the amount of time that you've traveled there, because it's so, you know, emotionally connected. The Feywild is very connected to nature and emotions.
Now, here's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Since the Feywild kind of dictates itself based off of emotion, in an example, if there's one person that was absolutely terrified, another person who was really jazzed about it, would they experience two different Feywilds at the same time, or would it be like a combination?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think as far as how I would like, the Feywild's so weird that it's rife for a DM to sort of make up whatever the fuck they want. And I don't think that there's a specific answer for that question. I think that it's up to the dungeon master to sort of decide how they want to handle that. If, in my opinion, yes, they would experience two different Feywilds.
Which that is a very cool idea.
Yeah, yeah, me too. That's really cool. So that's the Feywild, right? Like, that's, in broad strokes, that's basically what the Feywild is. But now we can start talking about the actual subject of our, you know, topic today, which is the people of the Feywild that are called the Fey. So a few general characteristics of a Fey is most Fey have magical or supernatural abilities, right? So they're like magic creatures. And they also have a strong connection to nature, or like the weather, or like elements. So almost all Fey have these, have that going for them. They are magical creatures that have a strong connection to the nature. All Fey speak the language of the Fey that's called Sylvan. So when you're looking through the player's handbook and you see the language Sylvan, that's the language of the Fey. That's what the Fey speak.
I wonder if there's any relation to Sylvanas, the god of nature.
You know, Eric, that's a really, really good question, and I do not know the answer to it. That's funny. It's weird. It's like it might be a coincidence.
Yeah, that can be some very good homework for our listeners.
So, another sort of general characteristic about the Fae that it doesn't summarize all of them, but it is a general rule that they are generally known to be mischievous, cunning, and sort of carefree, and also a little hedonistic. Just a little bit. There are a couple of there's many species of Fae, right? Like subcategories of different kinds of creatures that would categorize as Fae, but they all fall under one of three groups. And we're going to talk about them a little bit later when we get into Fae courts. But there are three different kinds of Fae: the Seelie Fae, the Unseelie Fae, and the Wild Fae. So the Seelie Fae are the more good-natured and beautiful Fae, but they're not necessarily all good. Like as I described before, where the colors might be brighter, but the shadows are darker. Seelie Fae may be beautiful and good-natured, but they can also be like overindulgent and very wrathful, and strong emotions, and they're distrusting of mortals.
So those might be like the dryads, nymphs, satyrs, kind of.
Yes, for sure. But I also am not you could have an unseelie of all of those as well, right? I think it's more like not necessarily species based, but like personality based, right? Emotionally based, right?
Right.
But no, generally you're right. Yeah. But unseelie Fae are selfish, evil, dark, malicious, right? But they're also on the opposite side of the coin. They're more accepting of mortals if they have something to offer, and less mischievous and more just straightforward. They don't like plan so many tricks. They just sort of lay it out flat.
That kind of sounds more like hags. I believe hags are Fae, aren't they?
Hags are Fae. We're going to talk about hags in a second. But yes, that I do believe that a lot of hags are, which is exactly right. Yeah, they're unseelie because, they may be evil, but they will make a deal with a mortal and keep to their word. So they may, we'll talk about hags in a second. But yes, you're absolutely right. And then the last group of Fae left are wild Fae, which are mostly creatures like animals and other Fae that don't really have any sway one way or the other. They don't really have a moral standing. So wild Fae could be like talking animals or something. You know what else? Just like I think that I always feel like Maleficent, from Sleeping Beauty. She's like an unseelie Fae, right? She's like kind of a bitch.
Yeah, she gives off certainly wicked vibes.
Yes, for sure. And she's a fairy, like they talk about in the movie, how she's a fairy. So that's very much an unseelie Fae, in my opinion. Now let's get into some of the specifics, right? Let's get into the species of Fae, right? The different types of Fae. So the people, quote unquote, of the Feywild they're like these elves that are called Eladrin. So Eladrin are like the elfiest elf that you can possibly think of. They're like World of Warcraft with the extremely pointy ears and the eyebrows, that's the hairs that sort of stick off their head. They are very emotionally charged, and they change form based on their emotion, right? So their forms are based on the 4 seasons, right? Spring, summer, fall, and winter. Their form can shift if they're if they're starting to feel sad, right? Then they might turn into a winter Eladrin. But that winter Eladrin form feeds into the sadness, right? So it makes them more sad. So it could be that, their emotions may change their form, but also their form changes their emotions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sounds a little unstable to deal with.
For sure. Eladrin are like the most commonly found in Fae courts. They're usually either Seelie or Unseelie. Not many wild Eladrin. Another kind of Fae are the Fae that are bound or associated very closely with nature. So like dryads, nymphs, and chorid are different kinds of Fae that are very, very closely attached to elemental sort of nature. there are also Fae that are born from strong emotions. So remember how we said emotions are like one of the key elements of what makes the Feywild the Feywild. So Fae born from strong emotions could be redcaps, meanlocks, or boggles are just examples of creatures that are sort of pop into existence from strong emotions in the Feywild. So again, like we were talking about earlier, the sort of geography of the Feywild is affected by your emotion. So if you're feeling really, 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 really angry, like you want to kill something in the Feywild, a freaking redcap might just pop out of the ground nearby you. And this is his first time existing. But now you summoned a redcap in the Feywild because you were so angry.
Interesting. So would that summoned creature, would it be like bound to your emotions, or would it just be spawned and then like free of its own accord?
Probably the latter, where it's just like it appears and is now like gonna live his life. It's just the Feywild is so strange. So there's also a type of Fae known as sprites, quote unquote. So little fairies, fairies. That's basically what they are. So sprites, fairies, pixies, quicklings, these little tiny things that like fly and are magical elf looking things. Those are called sprites. And that's another type of Fae.
Yeah, like Tinkerbell.
Yeah, like Tinkerbell. Yeah. And then there's a whole group of Fae that are called hags, which we were just discussing. Most of them are unseelie, but most hags are considered Fae. There are also several types of goblinoids that are considered Fae. Goblins, bugbears, hobgoblins. Also, there are many, 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 many species of animals that are either giant, speak, or both. So a giant speaking elk is probably a Fae.
Yeah, or like your earlier example of Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, exactly. But there's also more still types of Fae that don't fit into any of these categories that I've mentioned, such as changelings, satyrs are sort of their own category. Darklings and blink dogs are all types of Fae that sort of belong to themselves.
Changelings are Fae?
They are, yeah, they definitely are.
I didn't know that.
But all Fae fall under one of the three types: Seelie, Unseelie, and Wild Fae. And we're going to talk about that more when we get into Fae Courts. But before we get into Fae Courts, I wanted to get into something that I was really excited to talk to you, Eric, about. And that is the rules of the Fae. This is really the crux of the thing that I wanted to talk to you about. So the rules of the Fae, in quotes, laws of reality in the Feywild are determined by a vast sort of nonsensical web of convoluted and extremely confusing and contradicting rules. Very much like Alice in Wonderland, right? Where it just, for some reason, it always feels like Alice is breaking the rules, even though none of the rules make any sense at all. So another really important thing in the Feywild, other than emotion and nature, is words. Words have a sort of supernatural power in the Feywild. A simple sentence can have a million different interpretations to a Fae, depending on their mood and their history with the person that they're speaking to, or their history with that specific wording of the sentence. Because Fae have a tendency to make deals and pacts and bargains with mortals, it's sort of part of their being mischievous. But they always hold to their word, very much like devils.
So that's where the classic joke of "May I have your name" comes from.
Yes. And we'll get into that especially. But yes, exactly. You know how in fairy tales they say, the leprechaun will make a deal with you, or what's like Rumpelstiltskin. He's very much a Fae, right? Those sort of classic fairy tale sort of little men are always a Fae. They want to make bargains, but they will hold to their word. It's just always some sort of conniving, mischievous sort of plan.
Right.
Because their words hold power. They are bound to them. Words hold so much power that, like, if you're dealing with a Fae, a simple slip of the tongue, mentioning the weather, or really fucking any convoluted subject, could offend the Fae and cause one to be cursed or charmed for like all eternity. And they always curse you, or their bargains, involve some sort of really fucking esoteric thing, right? Like, for example, like you were saying, giving your name. I think like if a fae does something for you and you say, "Oh, I give you my thanks," right? That fae could curse you or take away from you the ability to ever be grateful ever again.
Oh shit! Seems like decorum is quite a challenging subject then.
Right. And you have to be very careful because, like I said, words have power. So if you say something like it's like a monkey's paw, right? They can interpret it to be whatever, right? It's like when there's that classic sort of thing in D&D where the player characters make a wish with the wish spell and the DM's like, "Oh, well, you said you wanted all the problems in the world to be solved, but now the world disappeared," or you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like there could be some sort of backfire and the fae could take something from you that you weren't expecting. There are a few rules that are sort of standard practice when dealing with a fae. And I have a couple of them here. I don't have like a whole list, but I have like a few of them that I thought were interesting that I wanted to like bring up to you, Eric, and for the listeners. So if they're ever dealing with a fae, they have a couple of things to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, and this rule will be referenced frequently, I think it's the most important rule, is never accept a gift from a fae. So fae have this sort of unspoken belief that every favor must be repaid, whether you wanted the gift or not. Right. So everything must be repaid no matter what. So if, they give you an apple and you say, "I give you my thanks," they're going to take your thanks from you because you offered it up as a transaction and they are expecting to get something in return.
Ooh, actually, that gives me an interesting idea. Like, what would happen if an adventuring party, like, unknowingly saved a fae's life? Like, that fae would be in their debt quite a bit.
Yes, exactly. And that drives them fucking crazy, right? Fae don't like that. They want to pay their debts as soon as possible, the better. Which, again, we'll mention the thing about giving your name to a fae. So rule number 2 is never give a fae your full name. So true names are a thing that we sort of discussed when we were talking about Yugoloths, right? If someone has your true name, then they have power over you. Right, especially in the Feywild where words have so much power. So if you give a fae your true name, they can possibly, if they want to, fuck you over or find you. Like you'll never be able to get away from a fae that knows your true name. So like in Alice in Wonderland, right? Like the Queen of Hearts, the Mad Hatter, that's not their names. That's their title. So that a fae may go by a title, but you don't ever know a fae's true name because if you know a fae's true name, you'll have power over them.
And like you said, I'm guessing that goes both ways, where if you give them your name, they have power over you.
Right, exactly. I mean, you don't want a fae to have power over you. That sounds bad, especially if it's a hag or something. So rule number 3 that I have is don't forget your manners, but never say thank you. So when dealing with a fae, as I said, they can be very easily offended. So be polite, but the words "thank you" implies that the fairy has done something like a favor for you. So never accept gifts from a fae, right? If you say thank you, it implies that there has been some sort of transaction and you are repaying that transaction with words. And it also could kind of be interpreted as an insult because if a fae does help you out, they may have did it because they wanted to. Saying thank you implies that now it's a transaction, right? That you're repaying with words again. So saying thank you, you can be grateful without actually saying the words thank you, because if you give them something, they have to repay it. And fae don't like that. They hate it.
I wonder if Valo has written like alternatives to praise just for fae, like saying "very good" or some such. Instead of
yeah, sure. Valo's book guide to fae.
Yeah,
absolutely. So the last rule that I have is don't consume food or drink in the Feywild. So there's 3 possible reasons why. Number 1, my earlier example, the food and drink could possibly charm or possess you to stay in the Feywild forever, making you never want to be able to leave ever. Very much like Calypso in the story of Odysseus, they were like eating the lotus flowers and they never wanted to leave until she like turned them into pigs or something. She's a fae. Number 2, it's possible that the food may taste so much better than mortal food that you may never be able to enjoy regular food ever again. Perhaps to the point where you would prefer death over never tasting it again.
Right. It's so unbelievably amazing. It just sucks the joy out of anything else in your life.
Right. Exactly. And the third reason that you probably shouldn't consume food or drink in the Feywild is fae are so closely related to nature that this berry bush that you just ate from could belong to a fae, right? A satyr or something. And again, never take gifts from a fae.
Or, don't eat a fae's relative.
I like the bush is sentient, and he's like, "You fucker." That's very much a Feywild thing, for sure, for sure. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to fae are the fae courts, right? So Eric, you don't know anything about fae courts, right?
Practically nothing.
Okay, so this is sort of the thing that I like about the Feywild and the fae rules, like how fae are so strange. I really like that, but the fae courts are something that I find particularly interesting. So in order to talk about the fae courts, you have to talk about archfae. So some fae have such strong emotions or abilities or beliefs that the Feywild sort of manifests power around these beings, creating what is known as an archfae. So, like I said before, your emotions can sort of shape the world around you in the Feywild. But also, if your emotions are so strong that, especially fae, because they're emotionally charged already, that it's possible that not only does the landscape change around you, but you become one with the landscape, right? You gain power from the Feywild. You feed into its, energies, its magical energies, and you can become an archfae. And the archfae are like the rulers of the Feywild. Rulers being very loose term.
Could an archfae become a mortal's patron?
Yeah. So it is a warlock subclass for the archfae. So they're like gods.
Oh, okay.
Right. So like archfae are like gods basically. But they get their power from the Feywild, so it's more like if a devil gave you power. You know what I mean? Like it's a very warlock thing. Is the pact of the archfae. So it's definitely a thing for sure. So there's like countless archfae. None of them are super important, but the most influential and powerful are Queen Tatiana and the Queen of Air and Darkness. Actually, I think it's Titania. That's it. So Queen Titania is the queen of the Summer Court or the Seelie Court. So she represents the Seelie Fae, right? The good-natured, sort of nice Fae. But again, like I said, they can also be like overindulgent and wrathful and don't trust mortals. So Titania is the queen of the Summer Court. And the Queen of Air and Darkness is the ruler of the Winter Court or of the Unseelie Court, right? She represents the Unseelie Fae. Fae courts are basically like a loose political structure that does very little ruling and more like Game of Thrones, like political scheming and backstabbing and gossiping and hosting parties and indulging, right? It's like a fucked up mockery of what a royal court should be. Very much like the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland, right? Like, what does she rule? What does the Queen of Hearts even rule? She's just a mockery of a queen. And that's sort of what the Fae courts are. It's just like they do all the things. They throw parties, they gossip, they politically backstab each other, and the court jester kills the duke. You know what I mean? And now he gets his job, but all of it is just for nothing. It's just for fun.
Yeah, it's kind of like a pantomime of mortal politics in court. It's set dressing, basically.
Yeah, it's almost as if the Fae, because I read somewhere, it's almost as if the Fae had seen what mortals were doing and were like, we want to do that. So they just started doing that because it's fun. I mean, I just think it's so interesting. Like the Fae courts do nothing. They do nothing. but they are so like important to the Feywild. But like so wild Fey, they're the ones that don't really associate with the Fey court. They're more like we're in nature, like a nymph, a water nymph or something in a lake. You know, they're unassociated with the Fey courts. They don't really give a shit. But the Eladrin are like all up in it. Okay, so that is the information that I have on Fey. Do you have any questions?
I do. So, I mean, with the Feywild being so almost alien to mortals, like the rules and the decorum are so fucking crazy. Are there any reasons that somebody would try to go to the Feywild to gain something out of it?
Well, there are. I mean, like fairies and such are, and like, you know, the pixies we were talking about before, they're like super magical beings. And like fairy dust is a very necessary sort of component in a lot of like wizard spells and stuff. So, and also like there's some plants and plant life and stuff that grows in the Feywild that doesn't grow anywhere else in the material plane. So it could be possible to like go there to harvest stuff for magical spells or what have you.
Okay. If a mortal went to the Feywild for a long time, would they get changed by it like they would if they went to the Nine Hells? Would they become like the Feywild equivalent of a tiefling?
So I will say that the Feywild isn't as like corrupting as the Nine Hells is. But I mean, there is a feat in 5th edition called Fey Touched, which sort of represents the fact that you've spent a while in the Feywild and some of its magical essence has sort of worn into your being. So I mean, yeah, it's possible for sure, but it's also like it's possible that the Feywild has, you know, affected you greatly, and now you're an Eladrin or something of the such. But it could also be that because the way that the Feywild works, that like time dilation is so weird, you could go to the Feywild, live your whole life there, leave the Feywild, and have no memory of it and be the exact same person. So I really think it's up for the DM sort of interpretation, but it is possible for sure.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, I don't have any other questions, but I will say just from this introduction, it seems like a very cool and what I'm seeing very underutilized part of the lore.
Yeah,
This is it feels very keyed into a DM being able to make up their own rules, being able to mess with their players, that sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely agree that it's underutilized. I mean, I would love to do an adventure in the Feywild, but it's a little daunting because of just how vast and confusing it all is. Like it's supposed to be hard for a mortal mind to understand. And we as DMs, and that's something that I always get tripped up on, is there like aberrations, Fey, you know, stuff like that are supposed to be these alien minds that we as mortals don't understand. But I am a mortal and I'm running this fucking game, you know, so I gotta try to get into the headspace of these things that we're not supposed to understand. So I do find it difficult sometimes, but there's enough resources out there to sort of wrap your head around how to understand a Fey.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
No, this was a fantastic fantastic topic, and I greatly appreciate you giving us all a rundown on Fey.
Absolutely. Well, I'm ready to move on to the sage advice if you are.
Absolutely. So for this week, what I would really like to pick your brain about, something that I personally struggled with as a new DM, is session prep. A lot of resources online give kind of general advice, like you should prep 1 hour for every hour you're going to play, or, you know, you should session prep, a few days in advance so you can think about it, kind of thing. But the actual way that you prep a session, to me, there's so many ways. It's like telling someone, oh, just go study for a test. Well, you can study a billion different ways. You can read the book, you can make notes, you can, blah, 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 blah. And with session prep, there's so much you can do. I think for new DMs, not even telling them what to do, but just saying, hey, this might be something you should think about, is very important. So I'd like to maybe start off with, on my first campaign, on the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, what I think went wrong, and then maybe we can talk about how to improve that.
Sure.
So, trying to prep for the first few sessions, I treated it more like one of those very old school, like text-based adventure games. Like, it gives you a description of the room and it says, you can pick up the sword or go to the next room. Like, it gives you like a little list of stuff.
Sure.
And I tried to write out the dungeon like that, where there was a set number of things all the players could do and a set number of ways that all the players could go. And then I would try and prep all those out so it's all sort of neat and tidy and like a story with, choose your own adventure. And on the very first session, I am very proud of you guys for doing this. You completely broke all of my session prep because you found a hidden door and found a way to open it to an area I had not gotten to yet.
Yep. Well, that's something that they do say a lot about session prep is prepare for everything, but also prepare to throw everything you planned out the window. So I will say, I have this quote from, just to start things off, and because I'm going to reference it a couple of times. I have this quote from this guy I used to watch on YouTube. It's a series called Web DM. And there's this man down there named Jim Davis, and he's a big proponent of this phrase, which is prepare everything you aren't willing to come up with on the spot. I find that that's a very helpful sort of phrase to keep in mind as we further the discussion. So like you were saying, you had planned to go for the players to go a certain way and they went a completely opposite direction that you weren't planned on, right?
Right.
Well, honestly, I could not have told you that happened, right? Like you played it off really well and you improvised very well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that the way that you sort of took the information that you did have and ran with it, that's perfect. Like you did a great job. Nobody even noticed that. So I think you did good. But to save yourself from prepping things that aren't going to get actually used, I think that there's like a couple of things to keep in mind. And I think the number one sort of rule is to know the adventure. Know who the bad guy is. Know what the plot points are. Know what important NPCs are going to give what important information, right? Because even if you have that in the back of your head and you have none of that prepped, right? You can always sort of draw the players back to where you want them to go by at least knowing what the motivation of your bad guy is, knowing what the big plot points are. If you had an encounter planned for one room, the players aren't going to know at all if you completely switch the rooms, right? And now they're in a completely different room than what it was originally on the map or on the dungeon.
I definitely agree, because what I found as my strategy shifted throughout this first campaign, I found what worked a lot better is exactly what you said, is have the overarching umbrella and then just make little clouds of, okay, this room has this, and this NPC is here, and this thing does this, and then as they come to it, sort of smush them all together as the players arrive, rather than strictly following like the logic of a book, where they can only do one or two things, and if they go off that path, then a few hours are wasted.
Well, so like you just said, the way that I prep sessions, right, is I have two sort of main things that I do, right? I have my DM notes on one side, which is just, I use Roll20, right? So I'll have one handout that I just filled out with it says DM notes, episode 69 or whatever, right? And I will write out the big plot points that I want to happen, or the list of encounters that I want to use, right? And we'll talk about encounters in just 1 second. Or like an NPC in the party wants to talk to one of the player characters to get the role play flowing, right? Some things that can happen whenever, or the order in which I want the session to go. And then on the other side, I will have what I call quote unquote encounters. So some people call those scenes, or, I just call them encounters, right? So encounters are the big things that are going to happen in the session, right? Like if they're going to go to a tomb or something, the tomb is its own encounter node. If they're going to go meet this NPC. This NPC has his whole encounter note separate. So when you look at my DM notes, it'll say, start session, blah, 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 blah. And then the next thing will say, see blank encounter, right? Or go to blank encounter. So that I will pull up a whole separate note that has my encounters. So like you were saying, these sort of bubbles. These encounters are built for drag and drop. You can place them wherever you think thematically it's supposed to go. I mean, if they go to the place that you're expecting them to go, then you have an encounter list for that. If they don't go to that place, you can steal what you need from that encounter and put it somewhere else, right? If you wanted these group of Nothics to give the information to the players and they skipped it entirely, you can drag and drop those Nothics into a library, and have the library Nothics give the information. See what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Same encounter, just a different spot. And the encounter itself is built for drag and drop.
Yeah, and that it is so much more flexible. I wish I had started that from the beginning, because I think that would have saved a lot more time. And really, it's almost more, for me personally, it was much more fun kind of working on the fly like that. Like, I had the encounter set up, but then the stuff in between, the role play, they're moving, that kind of stuff, I got to decide that based on how y'all were doing, and I thought that was much more fun.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a lot more freeing. You can just put the encounter wherever you feel like narratively it should fit. But another thing that I do is I have quote unquote random encounters or filler encounters, right? So these are, if encounters are major, then filler encounters or random encounters are minor. So I like to use my filler encounters or my random encounters as foreshadowing or giving minor pieces of information or just reinforcing the theme of the whole place. So if I want to have some information that I want to give the party, they could come across a statue that sort of, shows this piece of information in a sort of amorphous sort of way. But if your players are smart enough, they can figure it out, what you're trying to say, without it being a whole encounter. I know in the Tomb of Annihilation, I wanted them to know that, like, there was more moving pieces. So I had a whole list of random encounters that when they were traveling through the jungle, I would just be like, I'll roll the dice for pretensies, right? And be like, oh, you guys got a random encounter. And I go look at my random encounter list like I fucking didn't already know what encounter I was going to plan, right? And I would be like, okay, we're going to run this one. And this one has some snake people. Oh, you never encountered snake people before. Yeah, these snake people are after you, and they're like a huge important thing that's going to come up way later in the game. But I'm introducing them now as a light little thing so that you get your brain working on it. You've encountered these things before, right? It wasn't as high a stakes as it will be later when it's a major encounter, but it's a little minor encounter to give you information and foreshadow future events.
Exactly. And before this topic gets away from us, I actually wanted to circle back to one thing. You had mentioned, you keep your notes in Roll20 as sort of separate, little compartmentalized chunks. I think that is such a great idea. And I wish I had done that for myself, because I have been dumping everything into one Google Docs file, and it has become such a mess. Even with a 10 session dungeon crawl, it has become so overwhelming. I am definitely using Roll20.
Dude, I have like a fucking million. I have folders of ideas, like just fucking random ideas that I got. Like, if I come up with an idea, I'll make a whole other folder or a whole other file just for my weird ideas so I can pull that up at any time.
Now imagine that in a 50-page Word doc.
Yeah, I can't. I would not be able to suss it out. I have enough trouble with the fucking adventure written out on one big page. I'll break up that into a million different pieces. If there's a dungeon crawl, I'll generally do, if it's an easy sort of encounter, I'll lay it out on the notes. But if it's like a fucking crazy detailed thing where there's NPCs and puzzles and all kinds of crap, that gets its own thing. And on the notes, I'll just write, look at the other encounter notes, you dipshit.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to talk about this because I'm glad you brought this topic up, because I want to give you some advice. So I know that you're going to be running Curse of Strahd, right?
Right.
And that's not a dungeon crawl.
Oh, no, it is a entirely different beast.
Yes.
In all forms of the word.
So I wanted to give you a bit of advice for prepping for running a an actual campaign, right? Like, I know that a dungeon crawl could be considered a campaign, and that's all it was back in the day, but this is a real campaign.
Yeah, this is the first real proper campaign.
So a couple of things, and I'm going to feed back into prepare everything you aren't willing to come up with on the spot, right? So if you're going to prepare for a big adventure, something that I usually do is I have tools that help me improvise. So I'll have a separate little note of secrets or a rumor table. And the secrets or rumor table has like possible quest hooks, or just random bits of information or fluff, to make the world seem more real, right? And some of these rumors may be true or false, maybe not all the way false, but just misguided. But you can just, if the players walk around a town and start asking people, hey, what kind of information do you have? You can have a table to pull from to give them information.
That is, I think, an excellent idea, because it's much more realistic to get sort of general chatter about a place, and maybe, they will, the townspeople will know that there's a monster out in the woods, but one person might say it's a dragon, another person may say, oh, it's a chimera.
Right.
You won't
Exactly.
get the specific details, but you will get enough knowledge about, okay, something is going on.
Right. And if you're having trouble, like I do this a lot too, if you're having trouble like trying to figure out how to get your players to go to a location or something that you want them to explore, and you don't really know why other than them stumbling across it, you can use these rumor tables as legit quest hooks. Like you could be like, okay, it said in the rumor table that this random NPC knows that there's a chimera in the woods, right? Well, now we can reflavor that as the mayor of the town is like, hey, there's a chimera in the woods. I'll give you guys 100 gold if you go kill it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can still take that and turn it into a legitimate quest hook instead of just a rumor. Another, useful tip for larger scale campaigns is having a list of random names. Although I don't personally use that because usually my players don't ask for character names. If they do, I'll just pull up a random name generator. I'm at my computer, right? But it's a good idea to have a list of names, because as you're writing them out, you'll sort of get a vague idea of what this character looks like. And if you're going to prep NPCs, really all you need to do is just write out fucking bullet points. Eric, my whole notes, everything in my notes is bullet pointed. Everything. I have bullet points within bullet points, because I like to do broad strokes of what I want versus like the details. If there's something that I need detailed because I struggle with improvising these things, I'll detail it out. But there are some things that I feel comfortable enough improvising that I will just write out a brief sort of description in a bullet point. Like, for example, I really struggle with keeping the cadence of an NPC that needs to give the players information.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to sort of keep with the character, I will write out like little catchphrases or scripted lines that I like want this character to say that sort of gives the vibe of the character, right? If the character is like Gollum or something, they like always say their own name, right? They talk in the third person. So that helps me sort of get into the mindset of the character. So I will take the time to prep it out, because that's where I struggle. I
am very glad you brought this up. This is something I wanted to definitely mention to our viewers too, is bullet points. So this is something I did early on, where we had a helper NPC with the party called Glitterstone. She was introduced very early on. And when I was writing her, I wrote her like the description out of one of the Monster Manual books, or one of the module books, where, Glitterstone was abandoned early and lived on the streets, and she did da 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 da. And it was, I don't want to read a paragraph of stuff to try and find something important about her in the moment. Right. It could have just been orphan, sneaky thief, like jewelry. Like 4 bullet points, because I didn't need to write it all out. So that is definitely a tip for new DMs, is you don't need to write like a book. Use bullet points.
Yeah, bullet points is like my whole prep, Eric. Like literally all I do is write bullet points. I have bullet points for the prep for this goddamn podcast. I swear to God.
That's true.
So the other, like, another really good. I have two last ones that I want to talk about. The last, like, one of the last tips I want to give, the penultimate tip, is if you want to make sure that you have your session prepped to the fullest extent that you think it should be, I would always try to include the 3 pillars. Right? We talked about the 3 pillars of play before. Every good D&D session has at least touches on all 3 of the pillars of play. So if you want to have a role play focused game, that's fine. At least give it some light sort of investigation. Right? Give it some light sort of discovery. Maybe a little bit of conflict, like a arm wrestling match or something to add a combat in there, right? Do something where you have at least all 3 pillars of play, because that is what a good D&D game consists of. The game supports all 3 pillars. That's the point of the game.
Yeah, it's to make it a bit reductionary. A lot of people are here to roll dice, and roleplay is great, but having that element, absolutely, skill checks can certainly help bring people in and feel like they are invested in the story, not just kind of passively listening. I agree completely.
Absolutely. And my last piece of advice is leave some room for improv. I have the tendency to fucking plan out everything. I spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours prepping. Just because I like it. I like to prep. I love thinking about my D&D game, right? When I'm not prepping my D&D game, I'm driving to work, I'm thinking about my D&D game, right? I'm getting these ideas. I'm letting them simmer. I'm statting out everything. I'm writing down everything. But every session, you should leave a little bit of room to improv, because you can't plan for everything. And the more comfortable you are with improv, the more comfortable you'll become with improv.
Mm-hmm.
To where you could improv a lot of stuff and it'd be very quality.
And before we move on, I think you said something very important right then, is simmering on it. Like, just take, if you want to work on it the day before or a couple hours before, absolutely. But I found if I have days to sort of just stew on something and just think about it, I will come up with shit 2 or 3 or 4 days after I wrote something down.
I mean, I'm exactly the same way. The session will be over. I'll be like, oh my God, I have a great idea. I'll write it down. And then, like, right before the session, maybe the day before I play, I'm like, dude, what would be even better? And I write down an even better fucking idea. I always do that. I always top my last idea. So yeah, let it simmer. That's a good one.
Yeah, session prep isn't always writing down notes or anything. Sometimes it's just thinking.
Oh yeah. I mean, I find myself a lot trying to go to sleep in my bed, and I'm like, man, how could Valin fuck over my party this time?
I think it's usually the other way around, isn't it?
That's so true. So true. All right. Do you want to move on to the bit?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So we have a bit this week. And it's sort of, we're going to call it Rules Lawyer. This bit sort of touches on a sort of concept in 5th edition called ruling, not rules, right? So there's a lot of vaguely worded rules in 5th edition, and it's left a lot to the dungeon master to interpret, especially when, you can do anything in D&D. You can literally just do anything you want, and it's up to the DM to sort of adjudicate that. So me and Eric have come up with separate instances where a ruling needs to be made. And Eric, I'm going to let you go first because I'm very excited to see what you have.
Absolutely. So, hypothetical situation. An enemy barbarian picks up a kobold party member and throws them at a monk. Is that kobold considered a missile? And could they be then redirected or use
with
any
deflect,
of the other feats?
With deflect
with
missiles.
Deflect. Yeah.
Oh my God. All right. So here's how I'm going to go about adjudicating this. So I'm the kind of DM that's going to look at rules to sort of make sense of it all, right? Like, it's like it falls between the laws, so I have to find the law. So the first thing I'm going to look up is deflect missiles. So,
Not to get too off topic, I think actually it's important to define missile in this case, because when I first came into D&D, in my head, missile was like ballistic missile or
Oh my
a
God.
fucking dart or
you're right.
something like that. But in D&D, missile is more something thrown, right? Or launched through the air.
Right. So, just going off of what I am reading here in deflect missiles, it says you can you can use your reaction to deflect or catch the missile when you are hit by a ranged weapon attack. So all of those words are just fucking fluff, except for hit by ranged weapon attack. Those words actually mean something. Because ranged weapon attack is a thing. So what is it called when you're using a weapon that's not a weapon?
Improvised weapon, right?
Improvised. Yeah, so we're going to look up improvised weapons real quick. An improvised weapon includes any object you wield with one or two hands, such as broken glass, table leg, blah, 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 blah. Often, an improvised weapon is similar to an actual weapon and can be treated as such. Okay. A character proficient with a weapon can use a similar object if it were that weapon. Okay. All right. I have my ruling. According to the improvised weapon rules, it says that if it resembles a weapon, it can be considered a weapon. So I will, just off the top of my head, pull, I know a hill giant has like a throw a rock attack, and that counts as a ranged weapon attack. So if a giant can be proficient with rock, I don't see why a barbarian cannot also be proficient with rock. So in my opinion, and it says in the improvised weapon, you could treat an improvised weapon as a weapon. So I would say, in theory, yes, the barbarian could pick up a kobold and throw it at a monk, and the monk could then use his deflect missiles to launch the kobold elsewhere. Or throw it back, right? That's what they can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it says, so improvised weapon always deal a d4, right? And the monk's deflect whistle is 1d10 plus dex plus monk level. There's no fucking way that they cannot deflect this and reduce the damage to 0. And if it's reduced to 0, you could throw it again. So you could have the kobold thrown at you and then throw it back. Oh God, that is fucking beautiful. All right,
Absolutely.
that was a good one, Eric. Yeah, you agree?
I 100% agree.
Okay, cool. All right, so that was a good one, Eric. So here's my first one, a little more technical. So I want to know what happens if you counterspell a booming blade. The spell booming, the cantrip booming blade. So if a wizard is being attacked by a warlock, let's say, who uses booming blade, and the enemy wizard casts counterspell, what happens?
Interesting. Okay, thinking out loud. I'm going to compare booming blade to, I think, another similar damage dealer of divine smite.
Yeah, okay.
So booming blade is a cantrip, but divine smite is kind of its own thing, right? It's not.
Yeah.
Divine smite isn't a spell.
No,
because booming blade is a spell. Even though it's a cantrip, and it would be kind of a waste to do, counterspell. I still think it can be counterspelled because of that.
Right. So according to the spell description, right, the components for the spell is, one of the material components is a weapon, right? Mm-hmm. And then the description says you brandish the weapon used in the spell's casting and make a melee attack with the weapon. On a hit, the target suffers the weapon's normal effects and then becomes sheathed in booming energy and then blows up if he moves, right? So my question to you, Eric, is does the melee attack part still hit?
I would say since they're making a melee attack and it has to hit first, they're still going to get that regular melee attack. It's just kind of wiping away the magic off of it.
Right.
But they're still getting smacked by the piece of metal.
Oh, sure. Like a divine smite. I see. Yeah. That makes sense. I would rule it the same. Because it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the counterspell does just get rid of all effects of a spell, right? Like it prevents the spell from being cast. But I still think the opponent swung a weapon. It wasn't like a spell attack, right? It's a melee attack. So you have to use your strength or I mean, I guess a warlock might have charisma as their bonus or whatever, but you still have to use a melee weapon. So I think that the melee weapon damage still goes through and the thunder damage does not.
Yeah, you can't really dispel magic sword to the face.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I have kind of a little more unusual one for you.
Okay.
So, in this example, there's a high-level spellcaster that the party knows is probably going to cast a spell with verbal components.
Okay.
The monk wants to run up to the spellcaster and shove his fist into the spellcaster's mouth in order to stop the spell from being spoken.
Oh my god. All right. So, oh Jesus. All right. So the monk wants to shove his fist into the spellcaster's mouth. That's what I'm getting to prevent verbal components.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I don't really have any rules that I'm going to base this off of. I think I'm just going to go off of vibe.
Oh, this hasn't happened before?
I think I'm going to. So I like to err on the side of players. Anytime there's a rule discrepancy, I ask my players to adjudicate it to me. It's good standard practice to have the players look up the rules, so that if they do have a question or they're like disagreeing with how you want to rule something, they might see something in the rules that you were right. But if there is still a discrepancy, I generally go, okay, you guys are the players. We're here for your fun, not mine. Right? Well, we're here for my fun, right? But the players' fun is important. So, and they only get to do so much. You get to kill them 500 different ways. They only get to kill the bad guys. So I would say if a monk ran up on a spellcaster, I would make it their action, not like part of an attack, like because you can grapple as part of an attack. So if you have if you can have 2 attacks in an action, I would allow it to just be one action, and it's got to be some sort of contested grapple check or something. Where the wizard has to fight against it. And I'll also say that it's going to last until like the beginning of the monk's next turn. Right? So the monks have to use its action again to keep it going. But yeah, some sort of contested check, I think.
I agree with that. I think that's how I would go. Because like you said, erring on the side of players, it's within reason. I like to reward creativity.
Absolutely.
And I think, effectively being able to silence a spellcaster with an action, that's reasonable. There are other ways to do that in the game, so I think that is a reasonable thing to do.
Right. You don't get to add attacks on top of that, right? Like that's your thing that you do this turn. But yeah, exactly. I agree. All right, Eric. Here's what I got for you. So, how would you adjudicate a game of tug of war with the PCs on one side and 3 goblins and an ogre on the other side?
Okay, so this would be I guess you would call it a contested team skill check.
Okay.
So what
like a group check.
Like a group check. What I would do is I would have the players roll some sort of strength, athletics or something. Have the players roll that and add them all together. Have the goblins and the ogre roll theirs, add them all together, and whoever gets the higher number wins for the round.
I can see that.
So, I'm curious, how would you rule it?
So, I hadn't thought about it. I just wanted to throw it at you. But listening to what you had to say about it, I think I would do something similar, but I would treat it like I would make a static DC. That's the first thing I would do. So I would pick something relatively challenging, like a DC 15. Mm-hmm. And all of the player characters have to beat a DC 15. So if they are as a group, right? So more successes than failures. So if there's 4 party members and, 2 of them succeed, 2 of them fail, we'll roll again until 3 of them succeed and 1 fails, or all of them succeed. You know what I'm saying? Until it goes one way or the other. And if they all succeed, they gain ground. And the way that I do arm wrestling in D&D is there is different positions. So like when you start the arm wrestle, it's a contested check, right? So it's just athletics versus athletics, and it starts in the center. And whoever wins the contested athletics check, it goes to, the middle point. Or it like starts in the middle and it goes in the middle one way or the other, right? So you basically have to get 2 successful athletic checks in a row in order to knock the fist down, right?
More than one. It's more than one check. It's
right.
Okay.
See, it's different positions, right? So if what makes it fun and engaging for players, the players love this shit, is it starts in the middle. The player character wins the contested check. It goes a tick towards him. But then the NPC wins his and it goes back into the middle. Then the NPC wins the next one. It goes back to his side. Now it goes a tick in his direction. But then the player character wins again and it goes back into the middle. And this could go on forever. Like, it lasts way longer than you would expect. So it's fun to sort of create a static DC where the players have to contest that check. Just because that'll make it a little bit easier so they're not competing against the ogre and the goblins check. It's just it would get too befuddled in my head. I would just make a static DC and they sort of pull the rope on either side.
I really like the multiple stages you mentioned. I think that's much more realistic. I wish I had thought of that because very rarely, if in these contested things, very rarely do you go from starting to immediately finishing in one turn.
Right.
Like you said with arm wrestling, you go one side and then you pull back and then the other one pulls back. That's much more dynamic.
And players fucking eat it up, dude. They love it. They get so invested, especially since there's probably money on this game, right? Probably. Like players always be gambling. So there's probably money on this game. So they're like, they have a stake in it and everything. So yeah, making it full of tension and a whole event and not just resolving it in one skill check. It's sort of, it makes it more fun for everybody. Absolutely.
Well, interesting. 2 very similar, but with key differences ways of doing it.
Yeah. That was Rules Lawyer.
I think it makes sense that we pretty much agreed on all of it, on quite a bit of it, because in my mind, this is a very strong sign of a good DM is being able to rule on these kind of edge cases in a way that is satisfying. And not just, the rules say you can't, so don't.
That is the worst. Yeah, that is the worst. Okay, well, that was another successful episode of the Plane Hoppers Guild. How do you feel?
I feel very well educated.
Good. I'm glad. I'm very glad. Yeah, that was fun. All right. So we're going to end out this episode with another tip from the Plane Hoppers Guild Handbook. Plane Hoppers Guild Handbook tip number 228. You do not have to outrun the owlbear chasing you. You just have to be faster than the dwarf. That was it. Have a good day, everybody. Toodaloo.
Stay safe, adventurers.
Thank you for joining the Plane Hoppers Guild.